How do you organize individuals and organizations to create open source software? My guest today is Royal O'Brien. He's the general manager of digital media and games at Open 3D Engine, which is now part of the Linux Foundation. The seed code for this project came from a 3D engine called Lumberyard, which was developed by Amazon's AWS business. And then Amazon donated it to the Linux Foundation. In this conversation, I'm eager to talk with Royal about open source, collaboration, and community building. We're even going to talk a little bit about game jams and Discord servers. I'm Bill Sherman, and this is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Ready? Let's begin. Welcome to the show, Royal.
Hey, how are you?
So I want to start with you're working in the space of open source software, and you've been there for a while, right? And we're a podcast that's talking about thought leadership. So my question for you is there space for thought leadership within open source and to create thought leadership through open source?
So there absolutely is. There's a lot of approaches in open source that you see are taken. In a lot of cases, you'll find where you'll have a project that will start up and they'll kind of put the code out there for everybody to start using, but they don't really establish everything else around it on how you're going to get it there, how you're going to grow it, how it's going to become this thing, other than through, either a viral type of campaign or people just picking it up. And those things are critical, but having a plan of really operating it in a different manner that is still aligned with open source values, that's the key. So when we talk about the thought leadership, you have to think about who's going to use it, why will they use it, what kind of impact is this going to have, and then what can I do to kind of differentiate this, and how long will it take me to get there? That kind of thought leadership takes a lot of planning ahead of time on where you want to deliver it to be. So for example, when we're talking about, how we want to get it out there, it was different than let's just put the code out there and hope that people will grab it. Instead, it was, well, how do we get companies who would actually use this to be able to support it so that the people who are building and adopting it actually get a better experience and can build better things and to create better things. See, nobody wants to, especially with video games, nobody wants to play the game of creating the game. They want to make the game. And that's
Right.
the hardest part. There's a lot of money and a lot of time to get sunk in, and a lot of times successes that move to failures because of it. And if you're thinking ahead for them, that has a huge impact.
Right. So one of the things you started with the Lumberyard project at AWS as creating a platform and a new platform within AWS, and then talk about that experience and then the migration over to the Linux Foundation. So how did that evolve, Lumberyard evolve into Open 3D?
Yeah. So the funny thing about that process was first to take a look, is this something that people are they going to actually adopt this, right? Is it good enough? Will they take it? And when we took a look at it, it was like, well, it's in pretty good shape, but there are things that really could make it better. And the first thing was, how do we kind of, when somebody goes to build something on it, a lot of times in especially game development, you have to unwind a lot of code. It was built to do something. A first-person shooter engine was built to do first-person shooter, not MMO, things like that. And so part of the first approach was, let's make it modular so there's a lot less unwinding. That's a critical piece so that people can actually adopt and take what they want. That's what created that non-monolithic environment. So we thought people can really get into that because if they pull the piece they want, they can get it, take it forward, and build what they want. That was the first step. The second step was then changing the actual internal of how do you do things from a team that has corporate type of practices that work well, and then move it into open source where you have intellectual property constraints, you have different code constraints. There's a lot of things that go into that. And so then you have people who have been developing inside of a company that don't talk about what they're doing openly with the rest of the world. How do you get these people that have never dealt with that before to say, yeah, go talk to the world, share everything with the world that you're thinking and building? It is a totally, totally different leap. And you've got to keep working on it. The funny thing is, it doesn't just happen overnight. It really is a continual process.
So open source, I think, is best thought of as a movement. Would you agree with that rather than as an entity or a set of values? How would you answer that?
I mean, it's definitely a movement because we've seen, here's the thing with open source is that people have learned that open source actually brings a lot more benefits than not using open source. The security, the stability, the growth of the community, the maturity, it's really hard to compete with the velocity of open source. At the end of the day, either I go hire 1,000 people or I can move it into open source and build a successful campaign that actually has a much larger base that grows and matures faster. So I don't think open source was, any kind of a fad or things like that. We've seen this grow and evolve continuously, and there have been some of the largest products used on the planet. They're open source.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they run large parts of everyday experience, even though it's a layer or two below what people see on the internet, Apache, for example, right? With that, where I want to connect is the sense of creating a movement. One of the things in thought leadership is you can bang the drum as an individual or a small team as much as you want to try and attract attention, but it's far more powerful when you recruit others and they're excited about it too. And so one of the things that I think about in the magic of open source is how you get people to contribute their time on an individual level, or organizations say, this is in our interest strategically to contribute rather than directly compete. So
Yep.
how do you nurture that movement?
First thing is you have to look, there are always short-term and long-term goals, and then you've got to find the alignment between them. So for a company, at the end of the day, they're looking at both short-term and long-term. For different organizations, the short-term is, how can I use this in what I'm trying to build, and will it get me to where I want to be? Long-term is everybody going to be using this, or is this a space that I need to be in 3 to 5 years? And should I be supporting this with what my offerings are now? So from a company perspective, that's one aspect of it. Now, from a community perspective, it's a little bit different. It's, hey, I want to get this done and I want it to be usable for this particular piece. I have a felt need that I want to put forward. And the interesting thing is when you can get that alignment where the needs of the individual are no longer driven by the perception of what a company feels that you need, all of a sudden you have this alignment of business and community where they're building a product that actually they're working on a project that builds a product. That product begins to open up new markets. Those markets are areas that businesses get to move into. And as a result, they wind up being able to create new profits that they can then contribute back into the open source project. And that creates a flywheel because now you have the next iteration that the community is looking to have fulfilled. So it continually turns with that alignment.
So one of the things that I think about is that with open source, you can bring people together to solve a problem that would have been an orphan problem that no one would have touched because it didn't fit within any individual's responsibility or even any organization's area of interest. But you can create the space where say, okay, we have to tackle this together to make this work. Is that fair?
It is a fair statement. The funny thing about it is that when you're a business, even a startup, you're making bets. You're actually placing bets and hoping that that's what the market wants. In open source, the market's literally telling you what they want. They're coming to you. So it starts to reduce some of the risk. And then as a result, when you start getting involved, if other people latch on to what you're doing, well, your risk begins to get even more mitigated as a result of that. So it becomes an easier bet. But getting past that concept of how businesses operate, of placing a bet in closed doors, is a hard one to break.
Right, because it's often strategy followed by market research and testing. And then, oh, we actually found a potential buyer. Let's see how they respond once it's been built, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly it. And in this case, they're actually talking every day. It's funny when I take a look like at the Open 3D Discord. I see people in there and I watch companies and people and they're talking together. And you see these cool ideas or cool things that pop up and they're like, hey, we should make an RFP for that because that's something we actually want. That means that now you have this spec that's been put up, this request for process and a proposal. And the funny thing about it is that all of a sudden, all the other companies that might be able to support that go, hey, if we make these small tweaks in our offerings, we can actually support that. And so everybody puts a small percentage in and moves that huge ball down the road versus one or two people trying to move the Atlas stone.
Right, right. So let's push on Discord a little bit because I know it's very popular in the gaming and tech space, but all of our listeners may not be familiar with what Discord is. So can you unpack that and how that's part of what you're doing in community building?
So Discord is a lot of people are familiar with Slack, where you have kind of an
Mhm.
instant communication, instant chat. Discord is the same idea. It was built where gamers can build channels and rooms and share live video streams and chat and communicate. And the funny thing is that that type of environment, you are building basically a forum or a support place. The difference is that you're not waiting for somebody to post into a forum. You literally can put a question out and everybody can answer you on the spot. The trick with using Discord is to actually have it sectioned out into the interest areas, or else you wind up having everybody talk about everything and nobody being able to follow anything. So you have to be organized and disciplined inside for how it operates. And you have to get your community to actually help self police that. Because if not, you'll wind up seeing these stretched out threads that just become incoherent.
So I can see where Discord could easily become cacophony, right?
Mhm.
This concept of self-policing and sort of self-regulation is a thread that I think is deep within sort of what you're trying to achieve through open source as well, right? Where people agree to ground rules of how we're going to work together.
You'll find out that an open source project structure is really, really helpful. Not something that is so structured that it provides, iron walls, but you want people to have general guidelines of expectations on how they should, the code of conduct of how they should operate. And it's one of those things that the suggestion of how you should be in this environment is what allows that self-policing to occur. If you just leave it open to chaos and you kind of leave it to ambiguity, then people don't know what they should be doing. So then things begin to get interpreted and now you run into trouble. And so self-policing is a result of having the structure laid out for how you operate. People can observe and learn from it very quickly. So it needs to be a behavior that's also easily observable that they can then follow. And the corrections to people need to be very easy and slight to do without any kind of extreme hammers. You know, we'll see somebody who basically will post something about rendering, right? And they'll post it in general. Then nobody's like, oh, don't be silly. This is not where you. They just go, hey, you might want to post that over into SIG graphics, and you're going to get the answers you're looking for. And that's productive and self-policing. That person now knows they should go to that particular area to get it, and they will tell others to do it now because it was the easiest and least path of resistance.
And with that, it's also building community rather than eroding community because people look at each other and say, oh, you helped me out. And then I'm willing to help the next person in
That's
some
right.
way.
That's
Right.
right.
And so it's a very pay it forward sort of mindset on the community. If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. One of the other things that I know that you're doing with the community is the concept of a game jam,
Yeah.
which is very classic within the games world. But I think for organizations that are not in gaming, I'd love to riff a little bit with you about game jams, how they work, how they produce ideas, and how they create momentum. So, what is a game jam?
So a game jam is basically where you set a time frame aside. You pick a theme, and then you tell everybody make whatever you want that kind of follows that theme. So they're making different games and experiences. It's a place to allow people just to have the creativity to go nuts, where they're not trying to pick some super long-term project or build something for a company where they're under pressure. It is a way of, it's like an art class. You can express yourself and show the world the cool stuff that you can do. As a result, some of your ideas, you begin to talk with other people and learn from other people, and you begin to expand your knowledge. And it's that thing that little bit of adrenaline rush when you do something and you see it for the first time. You're like, oh, that was really cool. And somebody's like, yeah, but could you do this? And you're like, oh, that's even cooler. And then you start building upon that. And the result is that it begins to kind of feed itself over and over and over. And when you can cultivate that kind of environment, people really look forward to it. It's kind of like taking a vacation where you get that ounce of creativity. And the other part about doing a jam is making sure that they have all the resources so that they can focus on building something, not figuring out how to get started.
Right, right. Because it's usually constrained time, 72 hours or something like that.
Not always. I mean, so we're running the O3D jam that we're doing on October 18th, I think it is. And that runs for a month. We're giving them a
Okay.
full month to actually run it. because you're not going to 72 hours is not a lot of time. I mean, I've actually run jams in 5 hours, by the way,
Yeah, they're
and
crunches. Yeah.
and people have astonished me like what they've pulled off. I mean, like out of nowhere, we had students who never did animation systems that would bring these characters off of Mixmo, and I'm like, where did you get that? They're like, I found this script over here, I ran it there, and there it is. And I'm like, I got guys who can spend weeks on this and haven't figured that out, and you got it in like 2 hours. I'm like, this is amazing. I'm like, you should consider doing this for a living. You're pretty good at it so far.
I think one of the things about the jam, whether it's a week, a weekend, a month, is that concept of pressure and the arbitrary limit, where instead of trying to go after perfect, you're going after good enough and you're trying to solve problems to get a working prototype and try new things. And if it doesn't work, you shift your focus and you move on.
Most importantly, out of a jam that a lot of teams and people will learn, they actually wind up learning how to time scale themselves, because you'll find
Mhm.
somebody has these great grandiose ideas and they feature creep it and they wind up with nothing to show. And
Right.
as a result, I'll be honest, if everybody in the world actually did a game jam, they would learn so much about time management and how to actually understand the scope of work that I think they'd be a lot more successful, because that's usually where you run into a problem.
Well, and jams are also good for getting your hands on to the idea, seeing how it works, how you might contribute to it, as well as then you have to figure out how you're going to work with the team. It's got to be a self regulating team very quickly, because if you're locked in politics or back and forth and bickering, you get
Mhm.
nothing done.
Yeah, that's actually the funniest thing, is that when you're working in a jam like we're doing for the open source Studio 3D, is that you wind up using it. If there are things that are holding you back or slowing you down, you're right there in the mix. You can file a ticket. If you don't understand something, you can jump to Discord and get answers. So for the open source community, a jam is critical, because what happens is we get a ton of feedback on how this should be better, because people are actually putting it to practice in a
It's
very
giving you a
short term.
pressure test.
That's right. That's exactly it. So we get all of these new features and new fixes and new things, like even just UI UX, like the flow of this is horrible. I've got to do 10 steps. Maybe you should think about this. We make that change, the whole entire community gets the benefit of it. So there's really no downside from that. And that's what actually helps grow the community and grow the number of people who adopt it, who then share their ideas, and it goes back into the flywheel.
So give me a sense of how many people you expect to participate in the jam in October.
I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that it's a first one. It's very, we haven't gotten a lot of marketing done on it because it's super early. I mean, we're maybe 2 months into this
Right, right.
of releasing it.
Yeah.
I mean, of open sourcing, we're 2 months out. And so I would hope that we get at least a few hundred, which is, it's kind of an aggressive number. But I mean, you never really know, because people can just show up at the last minute. And the trick is also timing. You can't put it in the middle of a bunch of other jams if they're going to be doing those things. And so, the time that we picked is a pretty good time slot. So I'm hoping that we get a couple hundred. If we don't, to be honest, every single person that gets into the jam and does something is still going to be a huge contribution going back into the open source community, because they're going to find problems that they'll find when somebody actually wants to use this, it'll have already been found and solved. There's no such thing as a perfect product.
Now, am I correct in remembering this is one of the first game engines, if not the first, that would be open source? So this is relatively new coming into open source, or am I misremembering
I
that?
wouldn't no, I wouldn't say it's the first one. I mean, you've got like engines like Godot, which they've done tremendous work on, and there are some others. The difference just with this one is that it really has its roots in the AAA space,
Hmm.
and it started out as a AAA engine. All of it, there's maybe I think 1% left of the original engine where it came from, and so it is all of the pieces that are comprehensive from end to end. And that's kind of what differentiates it. And being able to do this, it's not where it's just focused on one platform. It's from the perspective that I can do Windows, but then I can do Linux and Mac and iOS and Android and consoles and all those. Having that full support across the board is very different than what you'll find out there. So I wouldn't say it's the first one, but I would say it's probably one of the most comprehensive ones out there. I've learned one thing in open source: don't compare yourself to others. It really doesn't help, because at the end of the day, people that are in Godot or using other open source projects, we are an Apache 2 MIT licensed product. They may take some of the technologies from this and use it over there, and maybe they'll contribute back, and vice versa. So open source is very much about sharing, not about kind of comparing yourself to others. So I try to remind people not to do that.
Thank you for that clarification. Something you talked about early with the game developers was trying to look 3 to 5 years ahead and say,
Yeah.
where do they want to be, right? And what space do they need to be in? My question for you is looking and building
Mhm.
this platform. Where are you headed over 3 to 5 years?
I mean, in
Where's the
three to
journey?
Yeah, 3 to 5 years. I mean, it was built from the ground up, not just to be a game engine. It's also made for simulation, automotive. I mean, you could see it in a LCD screen on a dashboard in a car because it's very lightweight and it's made for mobile type of environments. But at the same time, it's an open engine that you're talking about, the metaverse and things of that nature. And when you're talking about those, well, what is a platform that everybody can build from, and how can they build on that stack, and how they get to be adopted? And when you have enough companies and people that are behind it, it can become a default reference. Will it be? I mean, it doesn't mean that it takes over Unreal or Unity or anything like that, because they all have their place in the market too, and they do an amazing job. But when you're looking 3 to 5 years forward, you've got to look at the merits of what you're actually trying to build and how will it fit in the ecosystem in the space. And just in the context of metaverse, as
And
long
I
as
want
it's
to pause you there for a
yeah,
moment because I don't know if all of our audience members will know what we're talking about with metaverse. Can you give like a 30-second definition of what it
sure,
is? Because I know it touches on many, many things in terms of AR, VR, but go ahead.
yep. So metaverse, if you've seen like Ready Player One, is a great example of it. But it is a network of experiences, whether they're VR, AR. Think of it as your web browser, but in full 3D, full AR, VR, where you can go from experience to experience. In other words, I'm not stuck in one engine. If I decide I want to go play in Mario World, Metaverse Experience, 3D World, I can, and then come out of that and go play in a golf one or go play in a racing one. It's a place where you have a lot of different simulations and environments in a large network, just like we do on the web today, but in more of an immersive environment that is limitless.
Well, and that has application not only in the gaming space, but also the workspace.
That's right. That's exactly it. Because the reality is that, like I said, it's limitless. So being able to, once you enter that metaverse and you're in that experience and you have that, what the content is that you're actually consuming can change whether it's work or play. It doesn't matter because you're still consuming in the same space.
Right. So, one of the questions that I want to ask as we start to wrap up here is you've done this journey and you've worked on with leading the engine and now building community. What advice would you offer someone who would be starting a similar journey? So look back to the point where you started a few years ago on this.
So
What lessons have you learned that you'd share?
rule number one is stay true to open source. When you're having meetings and things, if you're an open source, you need to eat, sleep, and breathe it, and you need to act it. So that means that, hey, we're going open source, but let's have this meeting on the side to talk about what we're going to plan to do. That's not open source. And getting other people to really, go in that direction. You have to be thinking at all times about the community as a whole. You have to be thinking from the perspective that you're being inclusive. You have to be thinking of everybody. What are the environments that you're going to be dealing with? Because the minute you kind of narrow that scope, you're forgetting somebody. And when you forget somebody, that results in kind of that whole deterioration of what you're out to do in the first place, which is that decentralized growth. So I would say the number one thing is that you want to always be thinking community. That's just the key, no matter what.
Well, and inclusive community. I think that's a piece that you sort of underlined in there is
It
when you
is.
exclude, you create problems for yourself later on.
Well, that's if you're not looking at how your community can actually operate, especially with inclusion, there is so much brain power out there that you're missing out on. That's the reality. And it's really important to have that. So if you're not focused in that area too, making sure that that community can operate where everybody is a player. And that's, it's and that's a key element here because you don't want somebody to get stepped on or pushed down because of who they are, what they are, any kind of, gender, race, things of that nature. The funny thing is that when code goes in a repository, it's binary. Doesn't have a gender, doesn't have a color, doesn't have anything. It's code. It goes in. So you want to make sure that that playing field's level so that everybody can express themselves because getting involved in open source is where people are actually giving their time to this and they're giving their creativity and the things that they love that really just drives them every day. And you don't want somebody to not be able to do that and enjoy the fruits of their work and be able to show the world. It's just as amazing it is to them as it is to someone else who sees it.
Royal, I think that's a really great point to end on is that allowing people to show their best through their work and to take an idea and add their idea onto that of others. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. If you're interested in organizational thought leadership, then I invite you to subscribe to the OrgTL newsletter. Each month, we talk about the people who create, curate, and deploy thought leadership on behalf of their organizations. Go to the website orgtl.com and choose Join Our Newsletter. I'll leave a link to the website as well as my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you thought of the show.